really make this concept into something that can be used for religious studies in a very rigorous way. Before I introduce Anne, though, I wanted to just turn it over to Victor, who's going to hopefully tell us about the upcoming talks. You're muted, Victor.
Thank you, Todd. Sorry about this. So we have 2 other talks planned this winter, kind of, at least until April. One is taking place on February 27th from around 4 to 5:30. It will be both live in Groningen and online, so you will be able to attend online. But if you're in the neighborhood, you can come. It will be with philosopher David Ludwig from Wageningen University for a talk entitled "Bridging Worldviews Through Transdisciplinary Co-Production?" ? And then on April 2nd, we will have an online roundtable on the question of worldview education. So in a number of countries right now, religious education is being transformed into worldview education. And so we will have Trevor Cooling from the UK, and Marcus Davidson from here in the Netherlands, and Lenny Franken from Antwerp University, talking about how worldview education is emerging in these 3 national contexts, and the different reasons why this is happening, the local characteristics of these developments, and so on. Since Anya is here, we are hoping to have her in June, I believe, but we'll set the date later on. And you can access previous recordings of the previous seminars on our YouTube channel. It's called Exploring Worldviews. I've put the link in the chat. And so you can see Todd, Hugo, and I explaining what our project is about and what we've done so far. And over the next 2 talks, and with this one included, you can also see the dialogue developing between Anne Taves, for example, and João de Pina Cabral, and other people who've been coming along from the start, which I think has been one of the really great developments of this seminar series.
Super. Thank you, Victor. So just to introduce our speaker today, Anne Taves is a professor emerita of religious studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and is a past president of the American Academy of Religion. She has written many books in different dimensions of studying religion. The one I have is maybe a more recent one, Revelatory Events, 3 Case Studies of the Emergence of New Spiritual Paths. But just from the titles, we see a deep interest in the experiential dimension of religion. And I think that also, you can see that if you did have a chance to read the article that she had circulated today, we see the question of experience also emerging in a theory of worldviews. And I was very happy that Anne agreed to be one of the advisors to this project. And I've mentioned this before, but also because of her quite different interest in worldview from what I'm interested in. And as you may know, the project is looking really at the history of culture wars and how worldview as a concept got articulated within culture wars. And Anne made the useful criticism that to view worldviews purely, let's say, as conflictual and negative doesn't do justice to the complexities of worldview development. And so we did modify our program or project somewhat to think of apologetics, so that is the kind of religious engagement in culture wars, also from the standpoint of dialogue and mediation and such other interactions, so not purely as a history of conflict. So I was very happy to have had that input. I think I don't need to say more. I'm going to turn it over to you, Anne. Thanks so much for being here, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Great. Thanks, Todd. I'm really glad to be here. I've come to all the seminars. I've really been enjoying them. And I appreciate the variety of approaches that you've been including in the seminar series. And as you indicated, you know, my approach is kind of different from your overall project. Although I mean, my initial training in some of the books you were mentioning are historical. My interest in worldviews was actually triggered by a desire to locate secular and religious perspectives under a common rubric. And I wanted to develop an analytical framework that I could use to make even-handed comparisons in the context of teaching and historical research. For those of you that are in religious studies, you're probably aware that comparative work, you know, came under fire, critical assessment, you know, in the latter part of the 20th century. And so part of what I was interested in was seeing if we could develop an even-handed, fair-minded kind of way to, again, revitalize comparative work. So while I'm aware that Worldviews does have a rich history and has been involved in conflict, that hasn't been my primary focus. Like João Pina Cabral, I've been approaching the topic more theoretically, due, I suspect, having heard his presentation last time, to some shared interests, particularly in revitalizing various forms of analysis, historical on my part, ethnographic on his part, but comparative, I think, for both of us. Another thing that interested me about his approach, or another similarity, is that both of us are drawing in a kind of piecemeal fashion on work from other disciplines, including cognitive science, or in his case, embodied cognition. But if you've looked at his work, and I will just say that since our last talk, I got a hold of this book of his. I don't know that that's in focus. Well, it's called World, an Anthropological Examination. And it's a theoretical book. And it's clear from that he definitely tends to high theory more than I do. My approach has been drawn more, it's been more practically oriented. I've been drawing from other people who are actively trying to use worldview analysis. And with Egil Asprem, who I collaborated on this, I've been testing the approach that we're developing in the context of teaching historical work and some lectures. So my aim today is to present the theoretical approach that we've been developing and indicate some of the ways we've tested it and some of the places in light of this series where our approach overlaps with that of Pina Cabral. And the article that I shared with you offers an up-to-date summary of our approach. It positions it in relation to what positions it and synthesizes two alternative approaches, what I refer to as the systemic and cognitive behavioral. And then the article illustrates one of the ways in which it's being applied. So in what I'm doing today, and now I'm going to start the PowerPoint. I think. There we go. Okay, so can you guys see this?
Yes.
Okay, so, I'm wondering, you know, one thing we didn't, to avoid an infinity mirror, don't share your, okay. How do I make it not be gray? And
Okay.
how do I change slides?
You should be able to change slides by clicking or
In
using
the
the
program,
arrows.
though, in the program,
Yeah,
not here.
yeah, in Microsoft PowerPoint.
Ah,
So you have to go on Microsoft PowerPoint.
oh, okay. So now I can't see you anymore, but I can see my slide.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Cool. Thank you. So, okay. So, okay. This is an overview of what I want to talk about today. And I want to highlight issues that I think really haven't been the focus of our discussion so far. So in the first part, I want to talk about how I think we should and how in fact we are defining worldviews. And in a middle theoretical section, I want to talk about how we can elaborate on this kind of definition to make it more analytically complex and useful. And then in the last part, I want to talk about just briefly some of the kinds of analysis that we can do with these tools. And the approach that I'm talking about is built on some underlying premises. The first is that we need to theorize worldviews and ways of life from the bottom up rather than the top down. So we're contending that rationalized, systematized worldviews, whether philosophical, religious, or ideological, are exceptional rather than prototypical. And second, that to understand the multi-layered complexity of the multiple worlds that humans inhabit, we need to think about world making as an evolved capacity. And third, that to understand how we create, maintain, and negotiate multiple worlds, we need better tools, that specifically discipline-specific tools that rely on world-defining concepts such as religion, politics, and ideology are not up to the task. So these premises shaped how Egil, Asprem, and I approached defining worldviews. We were assuming that definitions must work across disciplines. So we did not follow Ninian Smart's lead, for example, and use terms drawn from religious studies, such as myth, ritual, and doctrines, because in our view, that would unfairly privilege religious worldviews over non-religious ones. And second, to find a definition that we hoped would work for everyone, we adopted a big questions approach, specifically drawing on the work of the Dutch anthropologist Clement Vidal, and actually I think he may be from the Netherlands, sorry, and Andre Droogers, who is a Dutch anthropologist. So Vidal's version of the big question is one that Rousseau and Billingham, who I discuss in the article that I distributed. It's one of the ones that they integrate into what they call their systemic framework. And this next slide is a table from their article that compares different proposals for cataloging the components of a worldview. I'm going to show several slides like this one with really small print, and the point here isn't for you to read these. The point that I want to make here is just that the one that's highlighted in yellow, that's Clement Vidal's proposal. That's the one that we found out about when we started, and the one that we built our model on. But the other thing that I want to point out is that it's part of a set of worldviews that are all based on big questions. And that's what Rousseau and Billingham are analyzing and then coming up with their own sort of overarching set of big questions. And for those that were at the talk by Sanchez, the one to the right of the yellow box is James Sire, who is a theologian and is the one who has been promoting the comparison of Christian worldviews for apologetic purposes with other non-Christian worldviews. So this next slide is our version of the big questions, adapted from Vidal, but then modified over time as we were testing them out in different kinds of comparative contexts. So first question is ontology: what exists, what is real? The cosmology question: who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? The epistemology question: how do we know these things? The anthropology question: what is the situation in which we find ourselves? The axiology question: what is the good or goal that we should strive for? And finally, the praxeology question: what action should we take? What path should we follow? Now, in adopting this big questions approach, we broke with most of the big question people in a couple critical ways. And so I want to mention them before I go on to how we tested this. So in contrast to Rousseau and Billington, and also Max Weber before them, we're not equating the big questions with ultimate questions, because it would bias our attention toward the systematized and rationalized worldviews. We're interested in both the explicit, highly rationalized attempts to address ultimate questions that are often studied by philosophers and scholars of religion, and the answers implicit in taken for granted ways of life, more commonly studied by anthropologists, including Pina Cabral. But in contrast to those anthropologists who focus primarily on differences in human cultural worldviews, Egil Asprem and I felt that the scientific study of worldviews would benefit from also exploring the commonalities between ourselves and other animals. Thus, while we, like Pina Cabral, turned to cognitive science, we did so with the understanding that non-conscious processes of making sense of the world are not limited to humans. So when you look at the big questions as we, then develop them, we did put all the traditional philosophical labels, at the beginning. And I've got to admit, it makes it look at first glance as if the claim that not only humans but other animals must answer them seemed pretty implausible. But the challenge, as we saw it, was to see if we could express the big questions in the language of predictive processing, which is a language that in cognitive science increasingly is being used to think about how all organisms process information. So as those of you who looked at the paper saw, this table here, another big one that I'm not expecting you to read the whole thing, but this table shows how we translated the big questions into the language of evolutionary predictive processing. And what I want to do here is just highlight the first of these big questions, talk about how we translated that one, because it kind of opens up into the larger point that I want to make with this. So the question of what exists, the ontology question, the way that we formulated that in the language of predictive processing is that organisms actively select and appraise incoming information against top-down predictions, which are based either in their evolved genetically based capabilities or on or on prior experience in order to guess what is. And what we're arguing is that in doing this, they create self and world models. So here's another way to formulate what we're trying to say here. That all organisms have evolved mechanisms for processing relevant information from their environment. That the portion of the information that is relevant to them, that is the portion that the organism has the capacity to process, constitutes its world. Third, the world of an organism is indexical. It is constituted from its point of view. This is really critical. And finally, having a point of view presupposes an implicit self-model. Now, in one of the series of talks, oops, no, I don't mean to go there yet. Hang on a second. Before I go to an example, I want to show you a quote from William Payton that sums up what we're arguing here. And William Payton, I think he's still with us. He's a scholar of religion from the US whose work on religious worlds and efforts to revitalize comparison, I frankly found quite inspirational. And so he talks back starting in 1988 about animals as world makers. And I just really like this quote. He wrote, "In the broadest sense, there are as many worlds as there are species. All living things select and sense the way things are through their own organs and modes of activity. They constellate the environment in terms of their own needs, sensory system, and values. They see or smell or feel what they need to, and everything else may as well not exist. A world of whatever set of creatures is defined by this double process of selection and exclusion." So now to give you an example, so in one of the series of talks that I've given, this was actually for a talk at the University of Otago in New Zealand, I took up the challenge of seeing if I could answer the worldview questions for a one-celled organism. So here we have Euglena, which is a single-celled, light-sensitive organism that depends on light for energy and nutrition, and yet also must move away from a light source that is too intense. So it contains a mechanism that allows it to recognize stimuli as light and then regulate its movement in relation to it. The key parts of this mechanism are the eye spot, the photoreceptor, which detects light, and the flagellum, which causes it to move. The eye spot doesn't actually detect light, but it positions the organism, but its position, the position of the eye spot in relation to the photoreceptor, allows the organism to determine the direction and intensity of the light. So to translate here, when the Euglena determines the intensity and direction of the light, it does so in relation to itself. So its view of the world is generated from its point of view. And in locating itself in relation to an environmental stimulus, the light, it has to make a basic distinction between itself and the stimulus coming from the environment. Now, in what I'm talking about, we're distinguishing between the environment as it is in all its complexity and the environment as selectively perceived by the organism, which is what we're referring to as its world. And if we make this distinction between world and environment, we can think of the Euglena as living in a world of light and dark. So, what are the implications of taking this perspective on worldviews? Well, first of all, if all mobile organisms must implicitly answer species-appropriate versions of the big questions to survive, then at least I'm pretty confident that the big questions offer a non-biased basis for comparing human answers. Basically, we can be pretty confident that all humans have to answer them in some form or another. And second, it suggests that if all mobile organisms are self and world makers, then our human world-making capacity is built on an evolved, non-linguistic, non-reflective foundation. Now, humans, of course, can do way more than just answer basic questions about ourselves, our environment, and our goals. We can articulate our answers, we can recount them in stories, we can pass them on to our children, and we can build social organizations to promote them. We do not necessarily agree on our answers. This is why we can have conflicting worldviews. We can debate them, we can try to convince others, we can force others to adopt our answers, and we can go to war to defend them. Humans create diverse, often conflictual cultural worlds defined by their tacit agreements regarding identity, meaning, and purpose. So that's the complexity of the thing that I'm arguing that we have to analyze if we're going to take human worldviews seriously in all their complexity. So we need more tools than just the big questions as I've been articulating them. So moving to part two, how do we elaborate on these basic questions to create more powerful tools? I'm going to talk about 3 types of worldview expressions. First of all, modes of expression, which indicate the degree to which the answers to the big questions are made explicit. Scale of expression, which indicates the level of generality at which the big questions are answered. And scope of expression, which indicates the extent to which answers to the big questions shift between situations. So I want to look at each of these more closely. The first, starting with the first mode in terms of modes of worldview expression, would be enacted worldviews. So answers to the big questions can be enacted in practice. They are embedded in a way of life. Enacted answers are mostly taken for granted. They're generally learned informally. They don't necessarily cohere with each other. They can be episodic and fragmented. And this is the mode of expression that we share with other animals. Now, I see a connection between this and what Pina Cabral talks about in terms of ontological weight. When he was analyzing the worldviews that he saw acted out in practice in his ethnographic work, he indicated that as a form of life is reproduced from generation to generation as a habitus, drawing here on Pierre Bourdieu, and I think that works pretty well with this. He said certain entities and certain configurations acquire greater centrality in its economies of meaning. These are facets of the world that for those who share that form of a life create a framework around which other facets of the world can arrange themselves meaningfully. So I think that's a powerful form of analysis of enacted worldviews to figure out if there is a kind of structure or ontological weight to certain aspects of the enacted worldview. Next mode would be articulated worldviews. These are answers to the big questions that can be expressed in words. What is said may or may not reflect the enacted answers, but we get additional powers with articulation. So articulation enables people to offer justifications for their behavior. We can also talk about memorized answers that can then be recounted orally. This enables more formal teaching and empowers specialists. Finally, we can talk about textualized worldviews that are preserved in writing. Textualization enables systemization, rationalization, and commentary. So let me pop up and make some general comments about modes. Again, comparing our work with Pina Cabral, he doesn't want to equate the minimal selfhood that cognitive approaches suggest we can attribute to other animals. He doesn't want to equate that minimal selfhood with the selfhood of normal, linguistically competent humans. We agree. And our distinction between enacted and articulated modes of expression, we're using that to mark that sort of boundary. To our description of articulated worldviews, Pina Cabral would add the idea that with articulation, with language, worldviews become what he refers to as transcendent. And he doesn't mean by that, as I understand him, transcendent in the religious sense. He means it in the sense that symbolic thinking allows us to move outside of ourselves. Another general point. In discussing textualized worldviews, Aspram and I, coming out of religious studies, have tended to focus on philosophical and theological systems. But I think that Pina Cabral is right to include science as a rationalized system. As he points out, it's a mistake to pretend that scientific rationalization can be the basis for a human form of life, since it is a technically specific form of engagement with the world that hardly satisfies the needs of human beings in sociality. Rather, scientific reason must be seen as the exception. I think that viewing worldviews from the bottom up makes it much easier to see how kind of partial these elaborated worldviews, systematized worldviews, can be in terms of our overall way of life. Finally, although it's possible to view these forms of expression developmentally, or from, say, a cultural evolutionary perspective, we want to counter that view by stressing that they are all present in literate cultures and that they build on but do not replace each other. They are always interacting. So we would agree with Pina Cabral that, quote, that ontology and metaphysics, which the ethnographer identifies within a form of life, will always be an unachieved process, unquote. And that, quote, humans are metaphysically dynamic. This is what makes the analysis of worldview dynamics so complex. Okay, so let's now turn to the next form of expression, what we're referring to as scale. So scales go from a micro to macro level, and we can define micro in many ways. But if we start by defining the micro level in terms of individuals, we can think of individuals as embedded in progressively larger groups of people. So you can see that in the left column. But if we think of humans as a species, they can be nested in progressively larger groups of animals, as seen in the right column. The key thing I want to point out is that different things stand out when we analyze ways of life at different scales. So if you compare humans to the other great apes, the common or shared human ability to develop, enact, and transmit very different ways of life stands out. What we share as in common as humans stands out rather relative to other great apes. But if we focus on humans, the differences between human ways of life tend to stand out. If we focus on individuals, the differences within a community or culture will likely stand out. So Pina Cabral's focus is on the analysis of humans, and what he refers to as ontological pluralism, I think, is evident at that level of analysis, but it's not as obvious or relevant, I would argue, necessarily at other levels of analysis. So comparisons and thus similarities and differences are always at a particular scale of analysis. The important thing to recognize is that whatever scale we select, it will enable us to see some things clearly and obscure others. It's also crucial to recognize that individuals may belong to more than one family and identify with more than one group. This takes us to the question of scope. So scope, as I indicated before, refers to the extent to which answers to the big question shift between situations. Who we say we are and the goals we seek to pursue often shift based on our context. We can think of the range of contexts in which a given set of answers are possible and permitted as matters of scope. Possibility and permission obviously involve issues of power and authority that are part of the dynamics within and between groups. So we definitely include issues of power and authority in the kind of analysis that we're promoting here. So the options for scope would include overlapping or merged identities. So for example, any hyphenated identities such as African American, distinct but compatible identities such as dual citizenship, distinct and incompatible identities such as presumably Christian and atheist. But if we think of identities as roles, that gives us, I think, even more analytical power. So we can consider the possibility of role-specific answers. If we think, for example, of sports, the umpire has a different role than the players and thus different goals. But the umpire can shift roles and play the game if he knows how to play it. Anyway, similarly, my goals shift when I'm in my academic scholar of religion role compared to when I'm in an activist advocacy role. And as discussed in the paper that I distributed, people have different roles in the mediation of conflicts. Again, to build on the dialogue between myself and Pina Cabral, I think he's getting at something similar when he says the root of metaphysical pluralism is in the singular person itself, in the person's capacity to isolate parts of his or her world from other parts. He and I aren't using the same language here, but I think we're getting at a similar issue. We adopt roles that are appropriate to specific situations, and in doing so, we, in effect, distinguish between parts of our world. Now, if you think about scope in relation to modes and scales, I think you can start to see something that it took us a long time to recognize. Specifically, that there are two fundamental ways to think about the big questions, to arrange the big questions. And this has major implications for using them as tools, which is where I want to go here in the last part of this. So in thinking about applications, we can think about two different ways to organize the big questions. And so to see what I'm talking about here, think back to when I talked about both roles and worlds being indexical. When we talk about something being indexical, we're presupposing an agent with a point of view and some kind of situation. The traditional systemic approach to worldviews, the kind that I think, you know, for example, what you see in the systemic presentation of the big questions that that Billington provides, that approach to worldviews doesn't have an agent in it. So we need to be aware of these two different ways of arranging the big questions. So in what I'm calling the systemic perspective or arrangement, the big questions are a set of interconnected components. They fit together. There's no starting or end point. You sort of can just go around the circle and see how they relate to one another. This perspective is useful when we want to see how a set of answers fit together and when we want to compare similarities and differences between abstracted worldviews. In an agent-based or agentic arrangement, they become a framework for goal-directed action. From this perspective, big question 4, the agent's characterization of the situation in which they find themselves is critical. How the agent perceives its situation is shaped by its answers to the first 3 big questions, the ontology, cosmology, and epistemology questions, and leads to goal-directed action, BQ5, by means of a path, a means of getting to the goal, which is BQ6. So from an evolutionary perspective, this is the more basic way of thinking about the big questions. At the human level, I think, excuse me, that the situation question may correspond or relate to, anyway, what Pina Cabral refers to as presence. As he writes, being in the world can only be made by an agent who is already a being for him or herself, processing an arena of presence and action. So I can illustrate how we could use these two perspectives in practice by displaying 2 of the tables that were in the paper I distributed. This first one, table 6, is a systemic comparison of what the person I was drawing this from referred to as liberal and illiberal approaches to peacemaking. To give you just a little bit of background, if you didn't look at the paper, the article I was drawing this from was written by a mediation specialist engaged in peacemaking process who comes at that from what he characterized as a liberal perspective. And the liberal perspective, he was arguing, has generally been taken for granted by many of the mediation specialists. And so his goal was to surface the presuppositions, to articulate them rather than leaving them embedded in their mediator worldview, and then to compare their presuppositions with those of the illiberal, what he called illiberal groups that they were trying to work with. And so I took the way that he described these two worldviews and used our worldview questions to characterize the differences between the two worldviews. Okay, so that would be an example of comparing two abstracted worldviews using a systemic analysis. The second example I can show you is Table 8, which is an agent-based comparison of three of the roles or identities that they were describing in the context of a peacemaking or mediation process. And so in this case, the situation was shared in common as being an intractable conflict based on firmly held beliefs, but it's really the identity question, who am I, that then determined the way that they came into the situation and the path or goal that they took that guided their action. So if you look at the BQ2, who am I, you see the mediators are identifying with a role, a situation-specific role as a mediator, and not identifying with a group in the context of that role. The negotiators had a dual identity, both as a negotiator within the process and as a group member. And again, the role as a negotiator was situation specific. The partisans were identified by a group identity. And this for them is a continuous identity, typically, rather than situation specific. So, and their identity, you can link then to their understanding of reality, which is defined by the group. And also note that the mediators and negotiators have different views from the partisan of what exists and what's real. Both of the negotiator and the mediator can simultaneously perceive multiple realities. So they're in a mode of ontological pluralism, to use Pina Cabral's terminology. And we also, the question of how epistemology, how they know this, the mediator and negotiator's roles are acknowledged by everybody participating in the mediation, if it's gonna go forward. But the identity of the partisans is defined by the group. So for example, by revelation or scripture or something like that. And this means that the goals of each of these players is different, and the path that each is going to take to get there, to get to their goal of facilitating the negotiations or finding a solution that works for all the parties or attaining a solution that works for their own group, they're going to have different paths to get there. Okay. In looking at these two examples, we've been looking at worldviews in the abstract. Neither of these analyses were located at a specific point in time. So what I want to indicate in a final example is that if we locate these analyses in specific points in time, we can then compare these, what are in effect snapshots, to not only analyze similarities and differences at different points in time, but also to detect change over time. So that opens up the whole question of worldview dynamics. And so we can do that both with a systemic and with an agent-based approach. In a systemic approach, we're looking at how changes in answers to any one of the big questions might change the whole system. With the agent-based analysis, we're looking at how actions will change specifically in or typically in response to changes in any one, well, actually still in terms of any one of the big questions. And here I want to look at one last chart from the paper. This table is a comparison of shifts in goals in response to how a situation was framed. And actually, in talking about the comparison of worldviews back before, there was a shift behind the scenes when the mediator realized that their liberal mediation principles actually were enacting certain presuppositions that he wanted to articulate. This is an example of when a mediator realized in the context of mediation that there was a conflict between what the parties were articulating and the way that the mediation had been set up in terms of its explicit goals, which was to enhance communication skills, and what the participants to the mediation were enacting. So that they were enacting their vulnerability as people who had been, whose dignity had been violated by the other parties who were at the table. And so the mediator, recognizing this conflict between the articulated goals of the meeting and the enacted goals, which what the participants were enacting initially was just a fight or flight response. They were refusing to say anything, and they were unwilling to talk. So she reframed the situation in terms of their own enacted perspective on the situation and shifted her goal from enhancing communication skills to restoring everyone's sense of dignity by encouraging them to name, acknowledge, and address the ways that their dignity had been violated through these conflicts. And in the process of doing that, I mean, they were willing to do that. And in that process, they actually resulted in a gained more empathy for each other and indirectly managed to enhance their ability to communicate. So that's it on examples. I could give you a bunch more, and I know I've gone through these very quickly, but I've already used up a lot of time. So I'm just going to conclude here by briefly mentioning what I view as the advantages of this approach, that it includes all of us. I've done BQ analyses where I included myself. It includes secular, political, and religious worldviews, as well as ways of life that don't make these distinctions. It is, I've argued, even-handed and offers a basis for comparison that doesn't privilege one worldview over another. We can use it as a tool for academic research or use it to articulate, clarify, and reflect on worldviews in various contexts, including our own. We can move between, we can analyze any mode and various scales. And it allows us to focus on how people identify both individually and collectively and how they position themselves and their groups in relation to others. So that's it. This last slide just gives you the series of papers in which I've been working primarily with Egil Asprem, but in terms of one of the papers also with Elliot Im on developing this approach to worldviews. And there's a set of two sets of unpublished lectures where I've also developed some of this.
Super. Thank you so much, Anne. That was wonderful.
I'm trying to find you guys.
We see you.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
There are already many hands up, not just clapping hands, also clapping hands. So the floor is open to questions, comments. There were Kim, Hugo, Anya all appeared to have hands up. Is that the case or not?
They were applauding, I think.
Floating hands. Okay, applauding hands. Okay, but I see Ana Fernandez Abayi. Would you like to open the floor with a question?
Generally, if you want to ask a question, do raise your hand, or you can write something in the chat if you're, for whatever reason, unable to talk, and we'll read your question, and we'll take them in order, yeah.
So I see Ana Jorge Zhao.
And if you can turn your cameras on as well for this part, it would be a little bit more convivial for everybody.
Ana, go ahead.
Thank you. Anne, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. And I wish I would have found you before. Because my research is on ontological diversity in environmental education. So I'm actually studying whether ontological diversity or different ways of understanding reality is relevant and should be relevant to the way that environmental education is designed, which the answer is obviously yes. But bringing one thing into the other is, well, it's challenging because of the way that the scientific paradigm sets everything up. So I wanted to ask one question regarding the self in the way that ontology is set up. Mm-hmm. So from what I perceived in the way you theorized ontology in regards to the self and the way that the self, whether it's a single cell or a human, is it possible, like in the case of the human, if the self is just the human, then it's impossible to overcome the anthropocentric perspective of worldview. Oh. But if the self would be open to understanding the self as beyond your skin, or so to say, other ways of understanding reality would be possible. And I'm just wondering if maybe you've noticed in the applied work that there might be cultures where the self is open to the more than human relativity or way of understanding reality. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think that all the modes that humans have beyond just enacting a worldview is what allows us to go to see beyond our own perspective. And I would suspect that some traditional ways of life might go more in the direction that you're talking about. The one that I've analyzed somewhat carefully, when I was in New Zealand doing those lectures, I kind of immersed myself in Maori studies for a little while. But I wasn't focusing on the relationship to nature. I was focusing more on colonial impact of, colonization of New Zealand. So, but I would say that just looking at that chart of the mediators, that was showing how 3 different roles could be oriented in relation to one kind of conflict. I mean, I think that might be a beginning template for thinking about the, the ecological world or other species or the natural world, however you want to talk about it, from different perspectives. And you as an educator might be in one of those mediator or negotiator roles where you're trying to work with people who have a single way of looking at the world and trying to broaden their perspective to be able to interact with other competing worldviews.
Great. Thank you. Did you have a follow-up, Anna, or did
Yeah,
you?
very quick follow-up. Very,
Okay.
very quick. So one of the methodologies that I'm actually using right now to open up the sense of self ontologically to the more than human is a methodology called the work that reconnects. It's a deep ecology-based methodology. Are you aware of other methodologies?
No, and I'm not aware of that one, and I would love it if you could put the information in the chat or email me.
Yes, I will definitely follow up. I'll email you with stuff, and I'll also put it in the chat. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, next is Jorge Sanchez.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Hi, that was great. Thank you very much for that lecture. I the methodology aspect, I find it to be quite fascinating. I'm coming from a philosophy background, and my current work is on the reconstruction and comparison of indigenous philosophical paradigms. And I found a lot of commonalities between Inuit, Maori, and Andean thought, Quechua thought, for example. But my interest emerged because I'm from Peru, so a lot of my education made sense of the Western world, but it made no sense, absolutely no sense, of the Andean world in which I was enacting all my experiences. So it was a complete dual existence altogether. My indigenous background was completely different from what I was learning at the university. So that's why I'm interested in these comparative efforts, and I think that your methodological tool set is very, very useful for the analysis. Now, I just have two questions that I would love if you could help me out with, because I would like to know if there's a significant difference between the notions of metaphysics and ontology in your work. I know because in philosophy they are used as different things, but I read a lot of anthropological work using them in exchangeable ways. And second, this is something that is underlying. I couldn't make a position or a particular view on your account, but the notion of the self and the definition. The more I read Western thought, the more I read Hegel. Right? I mean, not because I like it. I just think that Western thinking cannot avoid Hegel, and it seems like every form of the self is defining contradiction or in opposition to, which doesn't seem to be a necessary feature of something like Quechua thought, for example, right? Where the self is defined in a relational way, not necessarily in an oppositional way. So you talk about the self. If you could just elaborate a little bit on that to just clarify to me how, I don't think that any version, I don't think your tool set is committing you to any particular view, but I'm always wary of the German sneaking in and just giving us too much loaded concepts.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that feedback. On the metaphysical and ontological, I'm one of the people that hasn't worried about that a whole lot. I think that the article that I discuss, the Billington, Russo and Billington, they have a more elaborate set of big questions than we do. And as I recall, those guys are distinguishing between ontology and metaphysics. So you might go back to their article to see if that's a distinction that you find useful. So far, we've been able to get along with our more primitive list. In terms of the self question, I would absolutely say that we're approaching that openly. but in an open kind of way. So it would, I think the challenge would be to try that out with some different worldviews, like seeing if you can articulate in relation to those questions your traditional Andean sense of self, how that relates to what you would consider real, and who you or who we, the cosmology question of who you are, who your group is, and see if you can work out between those what seems to you like the appropriate answers to those questions. I mean, my guess is that you can that you can answer the questions in terms of a relational self. And it would be from the point of view of the subject. So if you think that God, I'm moving into sort of Western Christian thing, but if you think that God is separate from you, that's two different selves there. That's different than if I come in with a sort of multiple personality framework and I think that somebody's projecting God as some aspect of their self. Then I'm coming at a notion of self that's totally different from their notion of self.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Next is Zhao.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Anne.
Hi.
That was really fascinating, and I'm really overjoyed by seeing the way you've read the stuff that I've been saying. It's fantastic. It's really a privilege. Thank you very much. I didn't manage to read the paper. Actually, I didn't receive the paper. I think I didn't receive it, Victor. I don't know.
I can send it again.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Thank you. I was listening to you and I was thinking, I agree fully with this agent-based sort of pragmatic approach, which I think is fantastic, and with the way you are approaching it from the point of view of the as it were non-human, and then seeing the transfer to human questions. Where I worry is, I don't worry, but I think I would suggest that there is a point which is the question of identity, the relationship between a perspective before the world, being a self, and being an identity. This is something that needs elaboration, because the question of identity in this context may actually be problematic in the sense that it is always more plural. And so I was the thing that that distances or differentiates your perspective from mine would be my social anthropological preoccupation with the way collectivity enters into this process, the way in which the habitus becomes part of the agent. So that there is a kind of an internal immanent plurality to the agent, if you see what I mean.
So I was with you up through how the habitus becomes a part of the agent, but then why does that create a plurality?
Because your own perspective is shaped by the objectifications that the habitus provides with, or which are collective. And so it's that problem that Durkheim and Morse already had in the beginning of the elementary forms, when they or when they're saying, the human is the motor of everything, but then he's suddenly confronted with something that's pushing him from the back. So he's the original motor, but because he has entered into, because his self has become social in becoming a person, in transcending. Sorry,
No, I think I'm following you, and
it kind of comes to him as if from the outside. To him.
Okay. So Durkheim, the sense of society coming from the outside.
That's right. It's
Got it. Okay.
It's what I call the aporia of the collective. The way in which
Okay.
we are the mobilizers, but then we are mobilized.
Yeah. Okay. No, I agree. This is complicated and fun to think about. Okay, my mind's kind of going in two directions. One would be the kind of, I'll just name them as an evolutionary perspective and a multiple personality direction. So from the evolutionary perspective, I think we ought to put habitus. I think we've got to think about habitus in an evolved kind of perspective. And, there's other social animals besides us. And what would thinking about that do for Durkheim?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so that's one idea. And then the other idea is kind of what I was alluding to in my response to the last question, which is basically, from a abstracted theoretical point of view, how much of what we're talking about is projection. And, when Durkheim talks about the impact of society coming at us from the back, and that's why we think that there's totem, deities and totems and all that.
Yeah.
He's giving us a mechanism for thinking about that. How do we as a group create that sense that there is an other?
Yeah.
But that's when I talk about that and say multiple personality in quotes, I'm going into an explanatory mode that is not the mode of, it's not the first person perspective of either the culture or individuals.
Yeah. That I see. This could go on forever.
Yeah. Well, this is why I got all excited after your presentation and why I wanted to engage with you and see where things were kind of matching up as I did mine.
That was so interesting. And I wanted to suggest, because you talk of indexicality, there is this French psychologist called Boris Cyrulnik. He talks about pointing as the gesture out of which personhood arises. And that is really, I think, would fit very interestingly with your sort of stuff.
I think Tomasello, some of those guys work on primates.
Yeah, I think it's probable that Tomasello read Cyrulnik. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because between the English speakers and the French speakers, sometimes
right,
there's a big gap. But probably they are going in the same direction. It's this notion of pointing as the initial gesture of distancing.
Right. That other animals, my cat does not understand when I point at something.
No. Yeah. I've been trying to train my dog unsuccessfully.
Could you send me put the name of the French author in the chat?
Yeah, I think Victor did already, I think.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah. Okay, next we have Victor, Arjen, and Atko, and then Tanya.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this, and thanks, Joao, also for this question. Has been really great to see you guys talk to each other and to see you thinking with each other and to think with you. My question is about going back to what initially led you to Worldview, which is, as you said, you were trying to figure out, what sort of a framework to use to compare religious phenomena with phenomena that are kind of like religious phenomena, but are explicitly unreligious, right? And now the framework you've provided for us is in some way much more ambitious, in that it seems to be about providing, it's almost like Dilthey, trying to provide a method and a theory for all of the social and human sciences in a certain way, right? That can be used at least across a very vast array of disciplines. And it's also at a scale that seems to be much broader. And my question is, does religion mean something? Is it, is there a distinction between religious and non-religious worldview that's possible to make? Does religion exist? Because you also propose to replace religious studies with worldview studies. Isn't it possible actually now to continue with religious studies by taking it as a specific sort of worldview, taking religions as a specific sort of worldview? So that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah. Part of the frustration behind the scenes of making this move was, the endless discussions within religious studies about how to define religion, and knowing that on the ground, it's a highly contested concept, and that one person's religion can be another person's superstition or magic or whatever. And this became a way to transcend that problem and leave the definition of religion and arguments over what it is to the people on the ground. So I don't think either Egil or I were coming out of this wanting to define religion, but we can certainly put all the controversies over what counts as religion under this umbrella and explore them. I mean, one of the things, just to briefly say something about what I did in New Zealand, is in the revelatory events book, I was looking at emergent movements, and so that's what I wanted to look at in New Zealand. And there was a Maori Christian emergent movement that was both religious and political in our kind of terms. And I was looking at the way that it distinguished itself from traditional Maori culture as it was described by the Maori. And you could see there were key shifts in the meaning of terms. And a key term, Maori term, was basically redefined as superstition. And so all the practices associated with that in the Maori traditional worldview were then ruled out as illegitimate from this Maori Christian movement's point of view. And that was the kind of thing that I found the big questions in a dynamic kind of mode really helpful for allowing me to pinpoint precisely what shifts were at the root of the divergence between these groups. And yeah, just say one more thing. That's why I don't want to define it for us as from a scholarly point of view, because I think that those shifts in the meanings of key terms like religion are so critical in terms of the processes, the dynamic processes that we ought to be analyzing.
Right. Thanks. But just to add something to this, because, as you know, worldview has been used also as, in a way quite similar to religion, where people have said we have to develop our worldview. Now people are, UNESCO is funding people to protect specific worldviews. So what counts as a worldview is also being debated, So like the same question basically arises. You can't really, I don't know if one can.
Yeah.
Which is not to say, I think by looking for an answer, you've opened just another question, and it's been very fruitful, clearly. But I don't know if the question remain in a slightly different way. Perhaps, because worldview isn't as problematic as religion has been, or as important everywhere as religion has been. That it for now has been less of a problem to define, less of a political problem to define something as religion or not for the Maori. But clearly now the question is being raised by the Maori themselves as well, that they have a worldview, and Maori worldview means X and Y, and therefore people should do X and Y in New Zealand. So that was this. But thank you very much.
But I think your point about if the UN is going to step in and start protecting worldviews, that you're right.
Like
the problem is
say,
moving to a new level.
Yeah, someone would say, and Taves has said that worldview means X and Y, and there's all these different dimensions to it, and therefore what we have here is or is not a worldview, and this is what should be done to educate according to the Maori worldview, and so on, right?
If we keep the dynamics in mind, we can probably continue to analyze how contested these things are. But if there's stuff on that, I hope you can put that in the chat. I hadn't seen that the UN was getting in this game.
Yes, sure.
Great. Okay, next is Arjen Sterken.
Yes. Hi, and thank you very much for this lecture. I would like to ask you a little bit about, especially that cognitive evolutionary perspective that you're taking on. So early on, you were earlier in the lecture, we were talking about the so-called scale of worldview, where you have kind of like these diagrams like land, region, nation, and so on and so on. You also quoted in your paper, only you had a slightly altered model in this presentation. But in that kind of scale, you seem to kind of follow this quite Linnaean line of descent. So you have Homo sapiens, you have primates, hominids, then mammals, and then later animals. And I was thinking, isn't there this kind of different route that you could take with that by looking at social animals that live? Is that perhaps even a better division for that? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's a great point. So much of this is sketchy and not meant to be carved in stone. And not that long ago, I read a amazing book talking about Linnaeus versus this guy, Count de Buffon, this French guy who had just a way better approach that's much more like where the contemporary approach is to thinking about species and evolution. Anyway, so I wouldn't want this to go in some sort of Linnaean direction, like these are rigid things. So I think thinking about social animals and just, what kind of scale you want to think about. Those were just examples to try and get you thinking, which it sounds like you are, and I think that's great. So see what happens if you compare humans to other social animals. That kind of goes back to what Zhao and I were talking about, what's the nature of habitus, so to speak, if you think about humans compared to other social animals.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So go for it.
All right. Awesome. I'll take it as an encouragement. Thank you very much.
Next is Atko Remel. Atko, can you introduce yourself? Since this is
yes, thank you. I'm from Estonia, and my background is study of religion, and I'm interested in non-religion. And then this is the background of my question too. So and thank you for this fascinating lecture. I really admire your work on this worldview, because just like you, I really do struggle with this framework of religion, as all the scholars of religion do, or most of them. So my question is, and it's coming from my study of non-religion, is it possible to be without a worldview? Because you described the concept of worldview as inclusive, and indeed it is. But then the problem is that if we describe the worldview as you do, we end up with a similar situation as it was in 16th, 17th century with a discussion of natural religion. Everybody has to have one, and the way I see it, we end up similarly. So everybody has to have a worldview. So my question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, good question. I think this is where the modes analysis is really helpful, because I would absolutely say that not everyone has a systematized worldview that they're able to articulate. I mean, so I would argue that we're all enacting answers to these big questions as we're defining them. And I don't mean ultimate questions, right? That we're enacting answers to those, and that those can shift between situations. So that means that some people, I would suggest, have very fragmented, enacted worldviews that they take for granted and have never had an occasion to have to articulate them. And I think that contact with other points of view, other worldviews, is what often precipitates an awareness of what we're enacting and taking for granted.
Yes, I agree. But again, this reminds me a lot of the scholarship on and the concept of lived religion. So yes, and then again, your concept of worldview aimed to solve the problems with the concept of religion, but now we are actually back to the same question and the same problems. We have replaced just this umbrella system with another umbrella system, and this is my main problem.
Well, I still think we got to go from the ground up, and we have to have ways of life in there. So, one of the big problems in religious studies is that religion is a concept that, we've differentiated out from politics and art and all kinds of other things, right? Economics. And in many ways of life, those things aren't differentiated out. So we can impose a concept of religion on a way of life based on our definitions, but by talking about worldviews and ways of life, we can acknowledge that there's systems that may be more holistic and integrated and not necessarily articulated, or only partially articulated. I think why enacted is so important to keep as a foundation is because I don't think any of us ever can comprehensively articulate our presuppositions.
Great. Tanya Hummel.
Yeah, thank you for your article and this presentation. I'm a PhD student and I'm researching worldview ideas. Actually, I'm researching how these are clashing in the Dutch nitrogen conflict. So I had to find a way to analyze them. And when I was listening to your approach, it's very interesting how you extend it to animals as well. But I see then I see two problems then arising, and I wonder how you relate to that. First of all, and then I come back to what George Sanchez Perez says in the beginning with the questions. He had the question about the self and whether your approach was focused on the ego or the individual person. And in my research, I found already that there is a difference between people located in a Catholic area in the Netherlands and in a Protestant area in the Netherlands. And in the Protestant area, they define themselves as individuals, where in the Catholic area, they define themselves as persons because they become a person in contact with the community.
Mm-hmm.
That triggers in me the question of relationships, and with your big questions, I missed that relational part. So how can you build in that element? And my second question becomes, if we extend worldviews to non-humans, how do we deal then with things like ethics or metaphysics or religion? Because ethics, for example, assumes that we have a free will and that we are responsible for our doings. But how can we take animals responsible? So what are your answers to these questions?
Okay. In the first question, it sounds to me like you're trying to compare two groups, Protestants and Catholics within the Netherlands, right?
Yes, that's true. I compare more detailed dairy farmers in Northoost Twente, which is a Catholic area, and in the Food Valley in the middle of the Netherlands in the Bible Belt. I focus there on dairy farmers, and I compare it with 6 political parties. 3 of them are confessional political parties. One is on the conservative reformed side. The others are general Christian parties. And then the Green parties, which situate themselves as secular, but turned out to be linked to liberal reformed Christianity.
Okay, so what I hear you doing is you're setting up a comparison as a scholar of not just 2 groups, but a whole set of groups. But the question that you posed for me was that you saw differences between the Catholic group you described and the Protestant group you described, and how would I deal with that? That's what I heard, is that they had different views of the self, right?
Yeah, exactly. And since I agree with George or Jorge that listening to your story, I got the feeling that it was very individualistic oriented. It is my view to the world, and I missed the relational part in it.
Well, but you're saying your Catholics have a relation.
You define yourself in terms of community.
Right. So you just have to put their answers in the boxes. So the method isn't saying what answers to put in the boxes. I mean, I'm kind of caricaturing it here, but so if their answer to who am I or who are we is we ourselves in relationship, that goes in the box. If they're Protestants and they think that they're totally autonomous individual selves and the group has nothing to do with anything, then that's their answers to who they are. And then that allows you to do exactly what you're doing, which is compare how similar or different these 2 groups are in terms of how they understand who they are both individually and or collectively, or if they have no sense of collective identity at all. So all that's open.
I see. Yeah, I made it a little bit different because I was thinking like, how do we see the world, and how do we relate? How do we relate to the world, and how do we relate to others? Then of course you get this systematical approach and a practical approach. I'm a philosopher by background, and these are two coins of the same medal, so to say. You relate to the world, and then you have your actions. You live in that world. So there, my thinking went. But thanks for explaining.
Yeah, and I think part of what I was talking with the agent-based approach is that allows you to look at how they're answering the questions in a very specific situation. And, you know, if they've got a particular problem that both groups or all your groups are wrestling with, you could analyze their answers in relation to that specific situation, or you could ask in a more systematic way how they tend to answer them more in the abstract. You can move through a whole lot of possibilities. It's supposed to be a very flexible framework.
Yeah, I noticed that myself already.
Okay.
Thanks. Well, I had put myself in, but I somehow got eliminated. Kim, if you don't mind, I'll just pop my question in. So I wanted to pick up on that question that Atko raised about coherence and incoherence with worldviews, and also the question about religions. And obviously, I'm going to draw on the historical evolution of the concept. So the evolution, as we're looking at it, happens both in academia. So there's this certain trend, you could say, through cultural anthropology, social anthropology, that people have defined culture around the idea of worldview. And then also Benjamin Worf, linguistic definition of worldview, that worldview is implied in as a presupposition inherent in language. So there's an assumption of systematicity, I think, out of this academic tradition of the development of the concept of worldview. But then also it comes from outside of the academic context in the culture wars and so on. So worldviews, as Victor was mentioning, the fact that indigenous worldviews are emerging in law now, it has something to do with the fact that there are potent political forces behind it. And that's one of the reasons why it's emerging. So there's been this assumption of a coherence to worldview and a power to worldview that has come out of that political history of worldview. So you have Christian worldview, you had secular scientific worldview, you have Nazi worldview. These are all big social movements that attach themselves to worldview. So the term has a kind of power to it. And I'm, it's also in the way that we just use it in English, right? View seems to be a one point of view, a perspective, right, of a unitary subject. And at the same time, the world is another type of totality. It seems that worldview would represent it as one thing, right? The world is a system. So so anyway, there's all this power there in the history of the term, and it both makes your theory attractive because it, as Victor was saying, it seems like a very, very broad theory, but the danger in the power of the term is that it can also possibly, escape your attempt to define it, because the term itself brings all this baggage simply. And I'm curious about, do you ever toy with other options rather than the term worldview? Because it does imply already so much coherence and systematicity to it. And if you want to deal with incoherence, it's difficult with the term worldview to deal with incoherent, like whatever pragmatists would say, they don't have worldviews, right? They have a more piecemeal way of understanding the world. And I'm curious about your thoughts about, whether or not this powerful word is too powerful sometimes.
Yeah. Lois Lee, who's been doing research on secular and non-religious fill in the blanks. She and I, it was her, she asked me to comment on some methodological issues surrounding secularity and non-religion or something. And it was in that context that I threw in the towel and, you know, needed a bigger umbrella term. So she and I went around the choice of terms for a while, and she has some other alternatives that she liked. But I think that she's kind of come around to the worldviews language. And, you know, there's pros and cons of adopting a term that's familiar to everybody. But so I take your point, but I guess as an analytical tool, I'm really trying to push people to see the big questions as foundational and to look at what we can do with them. At what we can do as scholars if we make use of them as an analytical tool. And that then allows us to see and potentially analyze the impact of these systematized, mobilized worldviews as this is playing out right now in the world. And that, in fact, is one of the things, you know, I'm trying to figure out, you know, what the heck to do in the world that the US is rapidly trying to create based on our election. And so I'm looking into some of the right-wing worldview stuff that from coming out of right-wing groups that could be analyzed from this kind of big questions perspective to see if that would help me to have a clearer understanding of, you know, the similarities and differences and maybe some key points where it would be possible to intervene. And to me, it helps to clarify things that I don't understand.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I did really like the big questions approach as a rubric for comparison. I think that's very interesting. So Kim and then Srinka, and then maybe we after Srinka we should maybe round off. I think this is close to 6. Kim, go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you very much. This was really fascinating, the presentation and the discussion. I'm an anthropologist who got lost in religious studies. I was the PhD student of André Drogers, by the way.
Oh,
I know his work, and I also have a chapter in that book that you refer to. And I very much like that you want to develop this this notion of worldview from the ground up. At the same time, I also have a little bit of a sort of doubt around the vocabulary. So worldview as implying systems, etc. But I mean, as I follow your train of thought, it seems like it's not. There's also unsystematic worldviews, right? Implicit worldviews, and there I would like to connect back to the discussion with João to also and connected to the anthropological method of doing participant observation.
Mm-hmm.
Because also people with explicit worldviews have implicit worldviews, which may be different. And that's one reason why I always emphasize, especially as an anthropologist in the religious studies land, well, don't only listen to what people say, but look at what they do. And this is also what you did with this example of the, I forgot the name, but this one cell, I think, organism.
Yeah.
Yeah. So look at what people do. So in that sense, or people, organisms, etc. So in that sense, I wonder if there is not a vocabulary that could be developed that that emphasizes more not only point of view and this, but also the embodied position in the world, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And I so it's continuing a little bit this discussion on vocabulary, but also to introduce into the into your train of thought the methodological implications of it.
Yeah. Well, for me, enacted is, I'm presupposing a body, and that an evolutionary perspective assumes bodies. So, maybe that has to be spelled out more clearly, or the implications of that spelled out more clearly. But to me, that's totally presupposed by a bottom-up approach. And again, I think the power of naming the enacted versus the articulated and beyond is that we can look for the disconnects between those. And, just like you're saying, you've been emphasizing with the religious studies scholars. So I think part of the power that we get with thinking about those different modes is we can, I don't know, this sounds a little crude, but we can put the systematized theological, philosophical, and scientific worldviews in their place, so to speak, and start from another direction that then allows us to ask how those get mobilized, which is the question that we were just talking about with Ted and what's happening, or Todd, what's happening right now in the world. How are these more rationalized, systematized worldviews being mobilized for certain political ends?
Great, thanks. Okay, well, then Srinka Stimak, maybe you can introduce yourself since we haven't met you before.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm coming from the study of religion in Germany and working in educational area since kind of 13, 14 years. And I would like to, I'm so sorry that I was prevented to listen to your presentation, because it's absolutely matching my current project, and it's worldviews around quantum technology, which is so specific. And I would love that. And I hope very much that it's going to be, I don't know, it's recorded probably. I hope so. And the question I would like to ask is, how do you, in fact, I had that question before, or can you ask without knowing, and I hope you mentioned something about that in your presentation. From at which level do you differentiate and start to talk about worldviews when we are talking? I mean, whatever you have said, that everybody has some kind of opinion, either articulated or not. And this is, the question is of how the experience is extrapolated. And if we see in religion, whatever kind of experience is extrapolated into practice. And this is why religion is named religion, because there is a specific practice that people collectively consider religious. And in worldview, and this is what I'm struggling now, what would be extrapolation of everyday experience, of everyday life? In science, that would be method. In every silo, so to say, of a society, there is another way of extrapolation. And when do we start to say, now this is a worldview, and before it was just a sole opinion, And this is I don't know if I got you wrong there. And just a short comment on UNESCO and indigenous peoples, because I finished a long project on comparing international organizations on religion. And what I found in UNESCO since 1948 is that it was, especially considering indigenous peoples, that in fact, it is more putting indigenous people under the umbrella of spirituality. This is the convention 2018 is more, that was more a lacking of words, and putting religion, indigenous people spirituality, gender, ethnicity, and all of that under diversity. It is also more lacking words and lacking concept as clarity of what is going to, how to deal with the society. So it is I've written a little bit about that. I can share if you're interested, but I would be cautious about UNESCO's terms on, UNESCO is very much into holism, for example, when dealing with indigenous peoples. And so, but that's just a comment. I'm more interested in those worldviews. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me see if I can, just on the last part, it was really interesting to me in New Zealand to see how New Zealanders as a whole were dealing with Maori culture in the schools, and they were using the word culture, and because they weren't talking about Maori spirituality or religion, they were allowing some Maori practices to be enacted in school contexts, even though they don't normally do religion in school. Anyway, so that all had to do with these questions of definition. Okay, but your first question, it came down to, if I heard you right, when do we shift between opinion and worldview? I guess I would go back. I don't think Egil or I tend to worry about that too much, because we go back to the big questions. And the question is really, when are the big questions useful as an analytical tool? So if we're in a situation where some people are saying they have a worldview and other people are saying they have opinions, we can still use the big questions to analyze where they are in relation to the situation. So that would be one answer. Another answer would be, as Egil and I were working on this and realizing that we wanted to talk about worldviews and ways of life, and we wanted to take this evolutionary perspective, we asked ourselves whether we wanted to talk about other animals having worldviews or just humans. And that's kind of an arbitrary question. Clement Vidal, who we were borrowing big questions from, he does talk about other animals having worldviews. We decided we weren't so comfortable with that, and that we would rather talk about other animals having ways of life and humans having ways of life. We all have ways of life. And sometimes we talk about those explicitly as worldviews. And so that's kind of how we left it. But I realized that I'm wandering into the definitional problems and the problem between us as scholars and people on the ground. And so I know this is exactly the territory that Victor was warning me about, where it all gets very complicated. But that's kind of where we came down.
That's interesting. Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us, Srinka, and everyone else who I've not met before. It's great to have see new faces. So very happy about that. And we are, Srinka, I see that you're at the Georg Eckert Institute in, is it Göttingen? We're really keen on the educational component. There's an announcement that you missed in the beginning, which is that we're going to have a panel with looking at the role of worldview in education in the UK, Holland, and Flanders in a couple months. And so we should talk, though. I'm very curious about your institute. So anyway, I'm really happy that so many people turned out today. I think this was our best turnout yet, actually. You kept us going for 2 hours, Anne, and we could keep talking, I know. But it was a great session, very interesting discussion there afterwards. So I want to thank everyone again for being there. Please come. David Ludwig is not only a philosopher, but he also has been working as an anthropologist in Brazil, dealing with this question of indigenous culture, and I think questioning the idea of worldview on a practical level. Does it really bring results? If you want to look at how people interact with their environment on the ground, does worldview really help explain people's behavior? So I think that will be an interesting event. It'll be both in Groningen, but also online. So again, thank you, Anne, for the
Well,
wonderful
thank
afternoon.
you for all of, I mean, I just love having people coming from all these different angles and seeing what we can do with this. So I really appreciate the diversity of the audience that you've pulled together, Todd, Victor, et al. So
Great. Okay. And thank you, Victor, for organizing. And hope to see you all in a month with the next event.
So Todd, just a practical question.
Yeah.
Is there a way in Google Meets to download the comments?
Can we
I
just
can-
copy them?
I will receive them, and so I can send them to you, but it would be safer if you just copy them directly from the chat.
Okay.
Do
I just copied them. I can send them to you, Anne, if you want.
yeah.
Well, I think as I was asking you guys, I think I've also just copied them.
Okay.
Great.
All right, cool.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And see you next
Bye-bye.
time. Bye.
Bye-bye.